What makes a man cross that line? What pushes a person, trained to protect, to become the very thing he once stood against? This is not just a story of love gone wrong. This is not just another case of infidelity ending in tragedy. This is something else. A decorated soldier. A man who built his life on structure, loyalty, and honor. A husband who returned home from duty expecting to find warmth, love, and the life he left behind. But what he found instead, shattered him. It started with small things. Changes in routine. Late nights. A distant gaze. Excuses that didn't quite add up. The quiet unraveling of a life he thought was stable. At first, he ignored it, chalked it up to stress, the weight of time apart. But the signs kept coming. A whispered phone call behind a closed door. The smell of a cologne that wasn't his. A lie so obvious, it felt like an insult. And then, proof. The kind you can't explain away. The kind that doesn't leave room for doubt. He didn't find out by accident. He looked for it. He followed the unease in his gut, the voice in his head telling him something wasn't right. And when he finally saw it with his own eyes, it was like something inside him snapped. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment rage. This was cold. This was precise. This was a man trained to keep his emotions in check, making a decision. A calculated, deliberate choice. He didn't just confront them. He didn't scream. He didn't plead. He executed. And then, he did something no one could have predicted. By the time law enforcement arrived, the scene they walked into left even the most hardened detectives in stunned silence. The crime itself was shocking enough. But what he did afterward, what he said, that's what made this case unforgettable. This is the true story of Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter. A man who gave everything for his country, only to lose everything at home. A man who made a choice that would change his life forever. And a case that would leave a lasting mark on everyone who heard it. Stay with us as we break down the events leading up to that fateful night, the crime that shook a community, and the decision that left the nation asking one question: was this justice, or was this murder? If you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story like this. And now, let's begin. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter was the kind of man people respected. 35 years old, strong, disciplined, the type who never backed down from duty. He had served in multiple combat zones, carried out missions most people would never hear about, and lived by a code built on loyalty, to his country, his fellow soldiers, and most of all, his family. For years, his wife, Emily Carter, had been his anchor. She was 31, a school teacher, warm, patient, and by all accounts, devoted. To those who knew them, they seemed like the perfect couple. The kind of love that could weather time, distance, and war. But war changes people. Distance changes people. And when Daniel came home from his latest deployment, a grueling 9 months overseas, something was different. Emily was different. At first, it was subtle. The way she pulled away when he tried to hold her. The way she looked past him, instead of at him. A hesitation in her voice that hadn't been there before. Daniel had spent years learning how to read people, how to sense danger before it struck. It was second nature to him. And now, sitting in the home he had fought to come back to, the unease in his gut told him something was wrong. He didn't want to believe it. He told himself she was just adjusting, that maybe life had moved on without him for a little while. That maybe she just needed time. But the truth was something else entirely. A truth that would rip apart everything he thought he knew about his wife, his marriage, and himself. A truth that would turn a decorated soldier into a man willing to do the unthinkable. What started as suspicion would become certainty. What started as heartbreak would become fury. And what happened next would leave an entire nation in shock. Daniel Carter wasn't just any soldier. He was the kind of man people looked up to. A leader. A soldier's soldier. The type who followed the rules, did what was right, and expected the same from those around him. Friends and fellow soldiers described him as unwavering, the kind of man who didn't bend, didn't compromise when it came to loyalty. To him, loyalty was everything. It was what kept men alive in war zones, what held families together during deployments. If there was one thing he couldn't tolerate, it was betrayal. Emily Carter had been his rock. She was soft where he was hard, patient where he was relentless. She had a way of balancing him, reminding him there was life beyond military bases and battlefield tactics. As a schoolteacher, she was well-liked, known for her kindness, her warmth. Parents trusted her, students admired her. To those on the outside, she was the picture of a devoted wife. The letters she sent during his deployments spoke of love, of missing him, of counting the days until he returned. But letters don't always tell the truth. Jason Miller was a different kind of soldier. He had served too, a Marine who had seen combat just like Daniel. But unlike Daniel, Jason never fully left that life behind. Even after leaving active duty, he stayed in the world of violence, working as a private security contractor. His job took him to dangerous places, put him in situations where morality blurred. He wasn't the kind of man who lived by rules, he lived by instinct. And that instinct had led him to Emily. Their affair started while Daniel was thousands of miles away, an unspoken understanding between them that what they were doing was wrong but impossible to stop. It was supposed to be just a secret. Just stolen moments. Just a lie they could both live with. But secrets have a way of coming to light. Lies have a way of unraveling. Detective Laura Bennett had seen all kinds of cases in her 20 years on the force. Murders of passion, calculated killings, crimes of greed. But something about this case, the brutality of it, the chilling precision, told her this wasn't just another domestic dispute turned deadly. She was methodical, known for her sharp intuition, a woman who didn't stop until she uncovered the truth. And the deeper she dug into this case, the more she realized nothing about it was simple. Sergeant Travis Moore had known Daniel for years. They had trained together, fought together, survived together. He knew Daniel better than most. So when he saw him after returning home from deployment, something felt off. It wasn't just exhaustion or the strain of adjusting back to civilian life. There was something else. Something simmering just beneath the surface. Travis didn't press, but he paid attention. And when everything finally came to light, he was one of the first to say, "I should have seen it coming." Because the truth was, Daniel Carter wasn't the kind of man who just let things go. He wasn't the kind of man to look the other way. And when the reality of his wife's betrayal finally became undeniable, there was only one way this story could end. Daniel had spent his entire life following orders, trusting instincts sharpened by years on the battlefield. But this? This was a different kind of war. One he never trained for. One he never saw coming. He had barely been home a week when he noticed it. Emily was different. There was a hesitation in her voice when she spoke to him, a stiffness in the way she hugged him. She used to curl up against him at night, warm, familiar. Now she turned away. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. Until they weren't. She was always on her phone. Always texting, but when he walked into the room, the screen would go dark. Late nights, she would step outside, murmuring into the phone, her voice low. Daniel knew better than to ask right away. He watched. He waited. Then came the absences. The excuses. Just meeting a friend for dinner. School meeting ran late. Didn't you say you had training today? She had an answer for everything, but something didn't add up. A soldier knows when something isn't right. The same gut feeling that kept him alive in combat was screaming at him now. One night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Daniel reached for her phone. Password protected. That wasn't new. What was new was how she clutched it even in sleep, as if guarding it from him. So he searched elsewhere. The second phone was hidden in the back of her closet, tucked inside an old shoebox. It was cheap, a burner phone, the kind criminals used to avoid being traced. And what he found inside shattered everything. Texts. Photos. Explicit messages. Messages filled with words she never even spoke to him. And Jason Miller's name. Over and over again. Daniel sat in the dark, staring at the screen, the light from the phone casting a glow over his face. The rage that built inside him was like nothing he had ever felt before. In war, there were rules. Betrayal had consequences. He didn't confront her. Not yet. His training took over. He observed. He tracked. Emily thought she was careful, but she didn't know what it was like to be hunted by someone trained to hunt. Then, on a cold October night, she told him she was going out. A friend's house, she said. A lie, spoken too easily. Daniel followed her. No headlights. No sound. Just shadows. He watched as she pulled into a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. Room 214. Inside, Jason was waiting. Daniel didn't rush in. He waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then 2. He knew exactly what was happening behind those walls. And when he finally moved, it was with precision. A soldier's steps. Measured. Controlled. The door wasn't even locked. Jason barely had time to turn his head before the first shot tore through his chest. A single bullet. Precise. Fatal. Emily gasped, scrambling backward, her hands trembling as she pulled the sheets around her body. Daniel, please, the second shot silenced her. And just like that, the mission was complete. But Daniel wasn't done. He stood there for a long moment, the gun still warm in his hand, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. He should have felt something. Regret. Pain. But there was nothing. Then, without a word, without looking back, Daniel Carter did something no one expected. Something that left investigators stunned. Daniel Carter didn't run. He didn't panic. He didn't try to cover his tracks. The moment the last echo of the gunshot faded into the cold motel air, he did something no one expected. He reached for his phone, his fingers steady, his breathing even. He dialed 911, his voice calm, almost detached. "This is Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter," he said. "I've just executed 2 traitors. Send the police." He didn't say he killed his wife. He didn't say it was a crime of passion. He used the word executed, a word reserved for judgment, for justice carried out by the hands of the law. But in Daniel's mind, this was justice. The only kind that mattered. Then he sat down. Right there on the blood-stained sheets, between the bodies of his wife and her lover. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He just waited. Outside, the motel was quiet. No one had heard the gunshots over the roar of traffic from the nearby highway. No one knew that inside room 214, a soldier had declared his own kind of war. Minutes passed. Then sirens. The first officers on the scene had been expecting chaos, someone screaming, a suspect on the run, a standoff maybe. What they found instead was something that would haunt them for years. Daniel sat with his back against the headboard, his hands resting on his thighs, blood splattered across his uniform. His sidearm was placed neatly beside him on the nightstand, the barrel still warm. His eyes locked onto the first officer who entered. "I did what had to be done," he said. His voice was quiet, steady. "Honor is everything." For a moment, no one moved. The officers exchanged glances, unsure whether they were looking at a broken man or something else entirely. Then one of them stepped forward, gun trained on Daniel. Hands where I can see them. Daniel complied, slow, deliberate movements. His military training never left him. He knew how this worked. There was no resistance when they pulled him to his feet, no struggle when they cuffed his wrists. He didn't flinch as they patted him down, as they read him his rights. And through it all, he never looked at Emily's body. Never looked at Jason. He just stared straight ahead, expression unreadable. And as they led him away, one of the officers turned back toward the bed, toward the carnage left behind. 2 people dead. A soldier who didn't run. And a single phone call that turned a crime of passion into something far more chilling. Something no one could explain. Detective Laura Bennett had worked homicide for nearly 2 decades. She had seen crimes of passion before, husbands who snapped, wives who lost control, lovers who let rage take over in the heat of the moment. But this? This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. When she arrived at the station that night, Daniel Carter was already in the interrogation room. No fight. No questions. Just sitting there, hands cuffed in front of him, staring at the wall. Blood still on his clothes, but not a single sign of regret on his face. He had walked into that motel, knowing exactly what he was going to do. He had waited for the right moment. He had fired without hesitation. And then, he had called it in, like it was just another mission. Bennett stepped into the room, dropping the case file on the table between them. Daniel barely looked at it. He already knew what was inside. "You're not denying it," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Daniel replied. "You planned this?" A pause. Then, a slow nod. Bennett studied him. "Why call 911? Daniel's eyes finally met hers. "Because it was done. No anger. No remorse. No desperation. Just those 4 words. Like it was that simple. Most suspects rambled. They tried to explain themselves. They swore it was an accident. But Daniel didn't care about excuses. He wasn't trying to save himself. He wasn't trying to justify it. He had done what he believed was necessary. And that was the most unsettling part. With a full confession and undeniable evidence, the case should have been open and shut. No mystery, no investigation needed. But as the details unfolded, things got complicated. Daniel's defense attorney argued that he wasn't in his right mind, that this wasn't a calculated execution, but a soldier's mind breaking under the weight of war, betrayal, and trauma. PTSD, they said. The betrayal of a wife he had sacrificed for, a man he trusted. A ticking time bomb set off by the ultimate act of disloyalty. But the prosecution saw it differently. They painted a different picture, a man who had spent his life trained to eliminate threats. A man who had used that training not in war, but in cold blood. A premeditated act. Not a crime of passion, but one of control. A soldier deciding who deserved to live and who deserved to die. And the country? The country didn't know what to think. The case exploded in the media. Some called Daniel a broken man, a veteran abandoned by the very country he had served, driven to madness by betrayal. Others called him a monster, someone who believed his military training put him above the law, a killer who had no right to decide justice on his own terms. Every headline asked the same question: was this murder? Or was this war still raging inside a soldier who never really left the battlefield? After weeks of heated arguments, expert testimonies, and emotional breakdowns on the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent as the jury returned. 12 strangers, faces tight with the weight of the decision they had to make. Daniel Carter stood motionless as the foreman read the verdict: guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Not first-degree murder. Not premeditated homicide. The jury had listened to the defense's argument, that Daniel wasn't just a jealous husband with a gun, but a soldier who had lived by a code his entire life, a man trained to react, to eliminate threats, to act before thinking. That after years of discipline, sacrifice, and emotional suppression, his wife's betrayal had triggered something deep inside him, something beyond conscious control. The judge took everything into account: Daniel's military service, his clean record, his psychological evaluations, and the raw, undeniable fact that he had walked into that motel with the intent to kill. In the end, the sentence was handed down: 15 years in prison. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some thought it was too light. Others thought it was too much. Emily's family sat in stunned silence, their daughter gone forever, her killer sentenced to a fraction of the years she should have had. Veterans in the audience nodded solemnly, some whispering that Daniel had already served a life sentence in the wars he fought overseas. And then came the moment no one expected. Daniel's attorney leaned in, whispering about an appeal, a chance to fight for a reduced sentence. But Daniel shook his head. When asked if he wanted to challenge the ruling, he only said 6 words: "I did what I had to do." Then, as if the matter was already settled, he added, "Now, I'll pay the price." No anger. No defiance. No regret. Just a soldier accepting his orders, his fate, and the consequences of his final mission. What drives a man to kill? Is it rage? Betrayal? Or something deeper? Something forged over years of discipline, battle, and sacrifice? Daniel Carter wasn't just a husband who discovered his wife's infidelity. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life living by a code, where loyalty meant everything, where betrayal wasn't just personal, it was an attack, an enemy's move in a war he never signed up for. But was his reaction human nature, or the product of years of training, conditioning him to see threats and neutralize them? Psychologists debated the case, arguing whether Daniel was a victim of his own mental scars. Some believed the military had hardened him, stripping away the ability to process betrayal in any way other than violence. Others said he was a man who simply chose vengeance. Was it justice, or was it a tragic mistake? Had Daniel Carter snapped under the weight of his past, or had he done exactly what he had been trained to do? One thing is certain: this case left a mark on everyone who heard it. It forced people to question their own views on crime, punishment, and what it truly means to break. What do you think? Was this justice, or was this a man pushed too far? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching. This case was one of betrayal, honor, and the weight of a soldier's past colliding with an unbearable truth. Stories like this remind us how thin the line between control and chaos can be. If you found this case compelling, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the most chilling true crime stories. And next time, we're covering a case even more disturbing, a story of a seemingly perfect family, a quiet suburban home, and a horrifying secret buried beneath the floorboards. You won't want to miss it.